Welcome to this edition of Group Talk, Relational Data Access in XPages with our host, Paul Calhoun, the Director of Worldwide Enablement at GBS. Without further ado, here's Paul.
Welcome to everyone to the GBS Talks webinar we have today. Today's topic is going to be covering relational database access from XPages. So again, my name is Paul Calhoun, the Director of Worldwide Enablement here at GBS. I've been working with Notes and Domino since release 2. And prior to that, I did a lot with Java and relational databases. So, being able to have Domino access relational data has always been one of my desires when, getting in. And I found that, pretty much every environment that I went into and the Domino space existed in, that there was some flavor of relational database there. So we want to talk about how you can get in and, actually use XPages as the front end for your existing relational data, whether it be the databases that you have or databases that you have access to. So the things that we're going to cover this afternoon are relational database data in XPages using zero Java code. So when we talk about relational database access, a lot of times it's going to be done via Java and writing some Java code, and that seems to be a barrier to entry for a lot of Domino developers. So we want to provide a solution for how you can connect to your relational databases without having to write any Java code, really any code at all. Then we're actually going to get in and talk about how do you use JDBC. So if you need to connect to a relational database that's not one of the supported ones in the IBM stack, then we're going to then go show you how you can actually write the code to pretty much connect to any database. We're going to finish up a little bit with an introduction to the new relational database functionality that's in the extension library from OpenNTF and how you can utilize those tools and give you some resources there for moving forward in that particular space. And we'll do some demos along the way. So when you talk about relational database data in XPages, then primarily, again, understanding that XPages is a front end to Domino data, then you also want to use that as the front end to your relational data. Since built into the Domino stack, we've had access to relational backend data via DCRs, DECS, LEI, LCLSX, third-party tools, and JDBC. Those are pretty much the tools in your toolbox when you want to go in and talk about getting access to the backend relational data. All of those tools can be used to work with relational data in XPages. We want to focus in on a couple. So using DECS and DCRs along with LEI. So DECS and DCRs, if you're not familiar with them, are two tools that come to the party for free. They're available in the Domino server, and they're just, again, tools that are available to you to utilize. LEI is the premium option and simply allows you to do more bidirectional things. But if your target database is DB2, ODBC, Oracle, OLADB, or Sybase, then all the connectivity for connecting to those relational databases is already baked into Domino and accessible via DCRs, DECS, and LEIs. You don't need any third-party tools or drivers. You don't have to configure the plumbing. It's all there. So this solution, again, is a Domino server-based solution, and it kind of requires DCRs or DECS tasks to be running or the LEI tasks to be running. So in order to implement this, we just kind of walking through the kitchen sink instructions here. So in order to connect a relational database to XPage via DECS or DCRs, you set up the DECS task, you run that. If you're using the data connection records, then that's not even required because you can have a direct connection from the database. You simply create a Domino form, and it's going to be working with the DECS virtual field activity or mapped via the DCRs. In these instructions, you can swap out LEI if you actually are using LEI. So either a DECS or an LEI virtual field activity, map the Domino form fields to the relational database for your key records, and create a view that's going to display the data. Because we have to actually have some locally stored data in order to navigate the view columns. So we'll walk through these. Using those steps, you can then create an XPage to view the key local field data and the links to the document. So again, remembering that XPages is really a front end or a UI layer on top of data. When we implement this particular solution, it doesn't even really matter whether the data is in Domino or the data is in the relational database. We can actually feed that up back to the XPage unbeknownst to the end user who's actually accessing the page. Create an XPage that's going to use the DECS DCR form as the data source. So if you're using DECS or LEI, you need to make sure that those server tasks are loaded up and available so you have the back-end plumbing there. And then we create a form. You can use an existing DECS form if you've already got the DECS solution there. Simply use that form as the data source to display and work with the underlying data. If you don't have a form already, then you can create the form as the schema and then use the field mapping to go in and set up all those field mappings. Once you have that form designed in Domino Designer, you can go into the DECS administration and you can create a virtual form in virtual view, or, and this is something that I still find kind of strange, that we've done the XPages tour around the world, and I asked developers if they're familiar with the data connection records, and at least 50% of the audience doesn't raise their hand. So they kind of snuck data connection records in the R6 code stream. But it's been there and it's been available to developers, so it just allows you to create relational database access without actually having to go through the overhead of the process, if you will, the DECS administration task. So this is the solution that we're going to use here, primarily for simplicity, and because then it's a standalone sampling solution. So inside Domino Designer, we're going to click on Data Connections and create a new data connection record. And in the data connection record, that's where you're just going to provide a name for it. The class, the type that we're connecting to is DB2. So in order to implement this, if you want to kind of test this back at your house, on my test server, I've installed not the full-blown DB2 server, but the DB2 Community Edition. And the DB2 Community Edition is free, like free beer. You can go to IBM and you can download that and install it. It's a completely wizard-based install, so even if you've never done anything with a relational database, it's pretty simple to get the Community Edition all set up. So regardless of whether you're connecting to the full-blown DB2 system or the DB2 Community Edition, you put in DB2, you type a username and a password, and then the name of the actual database that you're connecting to. And in this particular case, again, to keep things simple, I'm going to actually connect to the sample database that is optionally installed when you install DB2 or DB2 Community Edition. So again, that you'll be able to take this code and work with it back at your house. You need to enable the application property. So on the database settings itself, there's a checkbox that says Allow connections to external databases using DCRs. You flip that little switch on the database property, and then that allows you to actually use DCRs to tunnel through or use the plumbing that connects to the relational database. You then simply go in and map fields in the previously created relational database fields for the DCR. So when I open up a field, for example, this one's the employee number, something that's a little bit foreign to Domino developers for it being a kind of a flat file database, is that when we create documents in a Domino database, we really don't have to worry about key fields or unique identifiers for each of the documents. And relational databases, for you to put data in a table, then there has to be a unique value that identifies that, and that's referred to as the key field. In this particular case, the best option for the key field is going to be the employee number. So the key field data is automatically stored in the NSF. So when we implement this particular solution, then we have the data that's in the relational database, but then we also have key field and then optional data that we're going to store in the NSF primarily for view purposes. But you can see at the bottom where we've identified the employee number as a key field. And then if we want data to show up in views, then we actually have to have that data stored locally in the NSF as well. Now again, it doesn't make any sense to set up this solution where you're storing all the data in Domino and all the data in the relational database. So we just need one or two additional fields that we can use in the view, for view purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and add the first name and the last name, data fields, and I'm going to turn on the store data locally. Every other field in the form, we're going to leave that box unchecked. So using the key record, and then we'll actually look the rest of the data up from the relational database. If data already exists in the relational database, then optionally you can go through the designer and you can import those external records. So you can go in and say, okay, there's already data in the relational database. I'm creating the Domino front end via the DCRs, so I want to import any existing data that already exists in the relational database into Domino. So that would import the key fields and any of that local data that I set up in my form, via the DCR record there. You're going to create a Domino view that's going to display the key field data and the locally stored data. So in this example, again, I'm storing the employee number, the first name, and the last name so that we have the view navigation capability. And this view then becomes the basis for my view XPage. So I'll create an XPage to display the documents themselves, and this is just standard XPage development. There's not anything that is relational or JDBC or data specific to this. I simply go in and say, using the document data source, implement the proper field type for the data that I want to put back into the relational database. We probably want to include, again, navigation buttons, so submitting, switching to edit mode, canceling back to the view XPage, all the normal stuff that you would just do in XPage development. We then also need an XPage that's going to display the view data. So we're going to have a link or a button there that creates a new record, and then optionally for a complete CRUD, create, read, update, and delete process. And then we'll also add a button to delete selected records. We'll enable the view column that displays the employee number to be a checkbox so that we can go and check records for those things to be updated and displayed. And when the view XPage is displayed, all the records with the key and locally stored data is displayed. And then if they click through one of those links, then it's actually going to load the underlying data from the local Domino database, but it's going to read all those additional fields from the back-end relational database. So the use of the DECS DCRs is completely transparent to the end user. You're just fronting the data via XPages. So this solution allows Domino developers to implement XPage front ends to their back-end relational database without writing a single line of Java code, or really pretty much any code at all at that point. So we're going to switch over to the virtual machine here where we've loaded this up. So just to kind of look at some of the underlying resources that are there, again, under data, I have my data connection records, and that's the DB2 sample data where I'm wiring that up. I then have, again, the form, that's the DCR data form. And again, in that employee number property box, that's where I've mapped my key field, first name, storing that data locally, last name, storing that data locally. But all of the other data is actually going to be read in from the relational database. And this form, again, is used as the data source for my XPage. I also, again, have that corresponding view, which is the DCR data view. And that is simply going to be displaying that local data. And I can use that again as the data source for my XPage. So just to kind of see where we're going with this, I'm going to go ahead and load up the DB2 Control Center. Like I said, on this box I have the DB2 Community Edition running. So with that running, the database that I want to connect to is that sample table that is available during the install. And specifically, I want to get in and work with this employee table. So if I open up the employee table, then you're going to see that these are the records that I have. So employee number, first name, middle initial. It has all of that information from the relational database. So it's stored in the relational database, and that's the data that I'm wanting to front end. So if I go back to my XPages, then I've created the DCR data view, and again, that's simply going to use in the view panel itself the underlying view as its particular data source. So in that view panel for the data where I've set that Domino view up, the DCR data view, and then I have the corresponding form that is simply going to then be my UI experience for the records once we load those up. So if we were to run this in our browser, let me close down everything else. So you see the traditional just XPage user interface. So I have the ability to create a new record. I can see all of the existing records that are out there. I can open up a record. I can put that record in edit mode. I can change things about the record, change Christina's phone number, submit that, and then that value is then updated in real time to the back-end relational database. I have the ability to create a new record. So I can come in, and really the only code in this database is the incrementation of that employee number. So if I come in and just fill this information out real quick, choose a department, put in a phone number, give myself a hire date. Let's see who I want to be today. Today I'll be a manager. I do have some education. male. Here's my birth date. That's my really real birth date, but I'm not this year. So put in a salary. And submit. Now, again, the user experience for the end user, the Domino end users, they have no idea that this is going anywhere other than the Domino data source. But if we go and we load up the DB2 control center and we look at the data in that table again, open that up, then you'll see that there's that information. There's that record that I just got finished adding. And all of that data is there real time in the back-end relational database. Okay, the data type mapping all just goes across there, and so again, this allows me to have that complete CRUD model. I can open that record up, I can put it in edit mode, change any of the values, submit that back, and again, that goes as a real-time update, up to and including going in and choosing a particular record and saying I want to delete that selected document. When I delete the document, then it also deletes the record in the back-end relational database. So if we open that up and we sort by that, then you'll see that that information is now gone. So using this particular solution, you have a complete CRUD model, create, read, update, and delete, using the XPages front-end UI without having to write any Java code. So as long as you can gain access to one of the supported relational databases, then it's a very quick and easy way to provide front ends to, again, the back-end relational database there. Now using DECS and LEI, this is kind of assuming, if you're not familiar with DECS and LEI, this is pretty much, I would say 90% of the use cases is for managing all of the data from the XPages or Domino interface. So if records were added to the back-end relational database, then they're not going to be here unless you also have some kind of sync or import process. If you need actual bidirectional data, then I would recommend going the LEI route. If all you're doing is really front-ending the data and managing the data from Domino and the XPages interface, then certainly DCRs and DECS will do the job for you. You'll have all of that done. Okay. So if you have, again, one of the supported databases, then that's certainly an option for you. But not all databases are supported. They don't have connections to all relational data sources. So in that light, well, we still have tools in our toolbox. So JDBC is an industry standard architecture that allows us to create connections via these Java drivers to the back-end relational database systems. And we can do this both via client-side as well as server-side JavaScript. So to implement this, if I wanted to do this via client-side JavaScript, you need to complete the following steps. First of all, you need that JDBC driver. So that needs to be installed in the Domino system and accessible from your code base. Okay? In this particular case, we're going to write a Java agent to make the connection to the relational database and read the data, and then we're going to call that Java code from the client-side JavaScript using, in this particular case, Ajax. So in order to get the JDBC driver, you need to contact your local DBA or go to the website support site to download that particular driver. And then you need to deploy the JDBC libraries to the appropriate directories. Now, it's a best practice to make those library files available to the entire Notes Domino system rather than just adding them directly to the agent or the NSF. So driver files come with a .jar extension, which is a Java archive file, and you can think of that just like a zip file, an uncompressed zip file. And you're going to drop that into the Notes Domino installation directory in the jvmlib.ext folder for extension. Once that jar file is there and the server is restarted, or when the server starts up, that's going to add all the classes in that jar file to your existing Java class path, which means that we can basically call that code from any agent in our system. So we then deploy those to the appropriate directories, and this is just a screenshot. Again, I'm using DB2, so I dropped the DB2 JCC jar into that particular folder. I also, if I'm developing locally, then I'll also need that on my local system. So again, I can just write and compile the code. We then create a Java agent that's going to use JDBC drivers. Now, I've implemented this as a Java agent, but if you're familiar with the concept of having an X agent, then you could do this via an X agent as well. So whether it's an agent or an X agent in the system, both of those solutions are going to work. Now, I know that this screenshot's really small, that the text probably is hard to read, but basically what we're doing here is going in and using the JDBC API to specifically connect to our backend database. And in this case, we're actually using a helper class, so we can pass in variables. And that allows me to actually not hard code the information directly into the system that I'm using, that I can actually call that particular helper class and pass those properties across. The Java agent passes those connection parameters to, via the Java library. So we'll go in and create a class that reads the employee names. We'll pass in all of our particular values to get the connection, including our SQL query that we're passing across. In this case, we're selecting all of the values from the employee table, that same employee table that we used in the first example. And then we're just going to return some HTML. So we're using getAgentOutput, and we're going to produce an HTML return value. Now, because this is an agent that's running, and we actually want to get the results of that agent real time inside of our XPage, then we need a way in order to execute that code from the client-side JavaScript. And one of the things that's built into the XPages toolbox, if you will, is the Dojo Ajax calls. So Ajax is what allows me to run a back-end process and then get some data back from that. So what I can then do is go in and, again, identify a target node where I'm going to display my results in my XPage, and then using the Dojo XArgs, I can pass in a URL, how I'm going to handle that, load that function, headless function, and then place the data that's returned in my target node, which is the HTML that's actually returned from the agent itself. If for any reason there's an error, then we can actually place something bad happens, so the system just doesn't blow up on them. So that would look something similar to the following. So back in Designer, we have the XPage with relational database via client-side JavaScript. So I've done two things here. So we have the click event. So if we go into the button in the event, I've got this code here, and they can click a button. So two different ways to actually implement this. They can click that button, but then we also have it in A5, A5.2 and A5.3 for the events on the XPages. They've implemented this on-client load event. And that on-client load event is, again, code that says, I want to execute this code every time the XPage gets loaded. And what that allows me to do is simply go in and have that code execute so that the user doesn't actually have to trigger anything. So if we load that up in our browser, take two, then you see that it's gone out to the relational database, and it's read in this case, I'm just reading that first column, the employee last names. Obviously you can read it, all of the data. In this case, again, we're just using the select statement, so we're pulling the data back kind of in a read-only mode. I can return the HTML. I can populate that data in an XPage element that's a repeat control or a data table. I've given them the option to run the script again. So if they've loaded the page and they've done something and they need to get real-time information, then they can get that back. The button's actually executing. It's just always returning the same results, and it's actually using Ajax. So again, that's why you're not seeing a full page redisplay when we go in and do that. So that allows you to have relational database connectivity from the client script, and the real magic there is the Ajax call by executing that backend Java agent or that backend X agent. So if we can do it from client-side script, then we also want the ability then to do that from server-side JavaScript. From server-side JavaScript, because that code is actually executing on the server, then that's actually a little bit easier to do, although we go through a lot of the same steps. So the following steps, again, you still have to acquire the driver. You have to write the Java code that's needed and to make the connection. put that in a little bit different directory. So now, because we're going to actually execute this code from the XPage, then in order for that driver file to be available to the server-side JavaScript that is executing in the XPage, then we need to put that in the XSP folder, okay, on the Domino server. Now once we've done that, similar to dropping it into the JVMlib folder for the agent access, then this makes all of the classes of that jar file available to the execution of the XPage code. We create the Java source again that's needed for the relational database system, connection class, and a class that calls that. In this case, I'm actually utilizing the new Java code element that's available in 8.5.3. Now, if you have 8.5.2 or earlier, then you can still do this by just creating the Java class. There's just more steps to it. The new 8.5.3 Java design element actually makes this really, really easy to create Java classes. Any Java class that you create is automatically included in the class path of the application's execution. So you just create the class, write your code, and you're done. In the new class dialog, again, we just give it a name, com.acme, whatever we're doing here. In the code, this is where we just pretty much duplicate the exact same code we wrote in our agent. So we're going to go and say, this is the read relational database. We're pulling in the Java SQL packages, and again, passing all of our parameters to connect to the back-end relational database. Once you've added those Java code elements, again, they're going to show up with their full package name right there in the Domino Designer under that code Java there. So you add that code then to an XPage. So in a server-side JavaScript event on the XPage itself, then I can go in and reference my code. So I can say, I want to create a new instance of the com.acme read relational database employee names class file from my server-side script. And then I can say, once I've got that particular variable, then I can actually then call methods that are in that class. In this case, I'm calling that getData method. That's all encapsulated in a try-catch block in the server-side script, so I can get the same functionality. So this is a computed field where I'm actually reading the information from the relational database, returning it to the computed field, and then if there was an error, then I make sure that we return that kind of nice error message to them. So this one's a little anticlimactic. The output from this one is going to look exactly like the previous one. So because again, we're reading in that same data, but this time we're actually doing that via server-side script and dynamically loading the data in a computed field. If they were to refresh it, again, all of that information is going to be listed there. Okay. So that gives you three options, if you will, that are tools in your toolbox that are going to allow you to connect to relational data from your XPages. You can use the option that is the zero code solution that is implemented through DECS, DCRs, and LEIs. You then have the option that is writing the actual JDBC code that allows you to connect to any relational database that there's a JDBC driver for. And finally, we're going to finish up with accessing data via the new relational database capabilities of the extension library. Now, there's a lot of confusion with the extension library now that IBM rolled out the official update Pak 1. So just to make sure that I've positioned this correctly for you, the update Pak 1 that came out via the official IBM channel is a subset of the functionality that was in the global extension library from OpenNTF, if you will. So when you're looking at and making choices about are you going to implement update Pak 1 or are you going to implement the extension library, then the real choice there is, do you want to start working with the JDBC connectivity and the social tools that are only available through the OpenNTF stream and not yet available via update Pak 1. So in this particular case, I'm actually using the latest build from OpenNTF so that I have accessibility to the JDBC functionality. So the 8.5.3 extension library contains all of these, and it certainly is IBM's goal that in the subsequent releases of the update pack, so update pack 2, update pack 3, then eventually you're going to see this as well as the social tools rolled into those update packs. Which one I'm not privy to, but you know, we hope to see the JDBC connectivity stuff implemented in update pack 1, and then that's just going to provide us another kind of official tool in our toolbox. But between now and then, you can certainly download the extension library from OpenNTF, get that installed and configured, and start working with that. So if you've implemented the extension library from OpenNTF, that includes some additional plugins to DDE elements to make implementing JDBC and XPages more native, if you will, because then they become native controls. The easiest way, I wrote this slide, and I've got an update to this in the end. This is, you know, the easiest way to learn about the extension library is to run the sample application that's included, which is XPages JDBC. And that was certainly true prior to about 2 weeks ago when the IBM Press book came out on the extension library, a step-by-step guide to implementing the extension library. So I would have to just step back from this slide a little and say probably the easiest way to learn about the extension library is to, you know, buy that book. And I don't get any royalties for that, although I will make the authors buy me a beer every time I recommend someone purchase it. So the sample applications out there, that's the one that has the sample code that are, you know, allow you to kind of get in and see, you know, what's going on with the connectivity. Now, in order to make this a complete turnkey sample, what IBM has done is actually included the functionality that's going to create a Derby-based database. And a Derby database is a file-based database, and that's what the XPages relational sample does. So it creates a local file-based database, and then that's what you use to interact with the existing sample code. Now, one thing that you want to be really careful with is when you're going through and you're testing this Derby database, again, that's, you know, written out to the file system on the Domino server, it's very, very clear in their documentation on the extension library and the sample is that this Derby database is not production ready. This is a file-based database system that, you know, is not going to scale very well at all for large data sets. So this is really only to be used for proof of concept and sampling. It should not be something that you ever want to implement in a production-based system. So I'm going to show you how to use this, but then I'll also show you how to wire it up to a relational database like DB2, in our case, the DB2 Community Edition. So using the sample application, you can click the Initialize Database button. And again, that's not required for all relational databases. That's just Derby. That's going to create the tables. Once you've done that, then you can run any of the samples that are included there. Okay. So just real quick, we'll pop out over to our designer, and we have access to the XPages JDBC. Load that up. I want to pop over to my server, tell HTTP quit. So inside the XPages JDBC sample database that comes with the extension library, then these are all of the XPages and everything that's available there. And the JDBC home is kind of the kickoff for that. So if you run that, then again, like I said, you can initialize the data there. Having to restart my local host. You can, you know, run through the setup of the data, and that creates the data, and then you can start running through the different samples. And so if you're familiar with XPage development and you start looking at this, the whole design purpose behind this is that this looks like an XPage. This looks, acts, and feels just exactly like an XPage, except now all of the data is actually coming from a back-end relational database. So we have, you know, tables. We can do it based upon a SQL query. We'll talk about that. We can pass in a SQL file. You can do more dynamic things with a parameter. So I can, you know, like dynamically load, you know, information. And so I choose a particular state. We'll go ahead and choose Texas. That's where I'm from. And so you can see that, again, you can make it very interactive by going in and creating interfaces that are very similar to the existing interfaces that we have for accessing the Domino data. So this gives you a flavor and kind of a feel for what all of the different tools are and what you can do with this. But you probably, once you're done playing with this, you want to see how to then map that directly back to your real database, DB2, Oracle, and that such. So let's stop my local web preview, go back to my server, load up HTTP. While that's loading up, we'll go back to the slides real quick. So to connect to a production database, in order to connect to that, again, you're still going to need the drivers. So, if you've already got the existing JDBC connectivity or the JDBC drivers for your target database, then we can use that exact same one. Once you have that driver file installed in the XSP folder, because again we're accessing this from XPages, then you create a connection configuration file. And this is actually done via the Package Explorer. And if you're not familiar with that, that's just the file-based interface for the NSF. So we switch over to the Package Explorer view and we can jump in, and in there's a web content WebINF folder. Now by default there is not a JDBC folder there. You need to actually go in and create that by just saying, create new folder, call it JDBC, and then inside that JDBC folder, we're going to create a .jdbc document. It doesn't really matter what you name that particular document. It's just a text file, but you want to make sure that you kind of keep it short and sweet and descriptive of what you're connecting to. In this particular case, I'm calling mine DB2 JDBC, and there's the base information that we need there. So at the very least, you need the driver, the URL, and then the username and password that's being used to access the backend relational database. And that must be available in, again, the deployed jar file, that driver. So that's the class file. Optionally, in the JDBC section, you can also set up a very simple connection pool so that when connections are made to this particular interface, they actually serve the connections out of the connection pool rather than making an individual connection every time. You then create an XPage and add a view container control to that XPage. And in the data section, because you've installed the extension library in your design environment, you now have this new data source called JDBC Query. And that's the XE JDBC Query control that's included in the extension library. Now, it's really, really simple at this point because of this interface and the data there. In the connection name, you can simply put in the name of the file, the configuration file that you created in the previous step. And then I can go in and say, okay, because I'm connecting to the sample database, then I want to return all the information from the SQL table called, in this case, administrator employee. And then you have to have a variable name for the view itself. We just call that view 1. We tell the number of rows to return, and then a variable for again, the view itself. So we set the connection name, set the SQL table property, and that's what's going to allow us to go in and get to the data. Now, the next thing, unlike a Domino view that you add to an XPage that automatically creates the column headers and column details, well, this doesn't do that. So we actually need to then go in and map a column and a column header for every column that we want to have displayed in the view output. So the column name attribute value has to equal the field name from the relational database system. So here in this screenshot, you're actually seeing my table schema from the DB2 relational database. So you see that I've got field names like IMPNO, first name, middle initial, last name. So and this is really easiest done from the source view. So if you add a view column object, then you can go in and add the column name. You have to give it an ID, and again, I'm just using view column 1. And then you probably want to drop a view column header on there that actually puts the nice information at the top. Give it an ID, optionally set it to sortable true or false. Once I've defined that first column, then I just, in the source view, I copy and paste that column definition for every column that I want to have displayed. And then I just change the column name and column values in the header to be descriptive of the data that I want to have output. Once you've done that, then you're going to see that, again, you have the exact same output that you would have in a common control. So we'll jump back over to our samples here. So in these XPages, I just had the xlib JDBC. So going in, that's exactly what we've done. We have our view container. The view panel is going to have, again, the data source. That's a JDBC query. We're pointing to that. In the column itself, in the view column, you can put in the information here, but again, that's probably easiest seen from that source view. So put that information there. Again, that column name has to map up with the field name from the relational database schema. And once you've defined the data source and the fields, and we have the database connectivity, then we simply run that. And when we execute this, you'll see that we then also get all of the data from the relational database. So employee number, Christina Haas. I could sort, okay, all of that output if I said the column was sortable. And to the end user, to the user that's running and working with the XPage, there is no indication to them that this data is located anywhere other than Domino, as far as they know, and it's actually data just being served out from the Domino server, even though we're going directly to a relational database, and there is no transient data that's actually stored in Notes and Domino. Okay? All we have is the design. So that provides you the ability to create a very quick, fast interface to your backend relational data via XPages using native controls. And again, it was a little, it wasn't maybe quite apparent, but in this particular example too, I haven't written a single line of Java. I haven't gone in and created any logic, if you will, in order to actually implement the output and the implementation of the output that you saw there. One of the additional benefits is not only can I point to an existing table, a SQL table, and return all of the data in its entirety, but one of the new properties that's available to the data connection for the JDBC query is I can actually pass in a select statement. And that select statement can be just a standard SQL query. It can also be a parameterized statement that we'll look at here in just a little bit. But in this case, for example, maybe I only want to return all of the employees that are in a particular work department. So in this case, we're saying we only want the employees from D11 there. So I can go in and pass that in with, those are the parameters, those are the SQL query. So again, looking at the view data source,